So would you agree with former Chairman Ben Bernanke when he said in a 2007 speech on trade that restricting trade by imposing tariffs, quotas, or other barriers is exactly the wrong thing to do for the economy?
I would, assuming you're talking about them remaining in place over a sustained period of time, absolutely.
Well, you know, I get a little frustrated by this short-term pain for long-term gain. I think that we're going to have long-term consequences in agriculture because I think we're going to have emerging markets in a competitive space that we haven't before. We already see the Chinese are subsidizing their farmers to grow soybeans. We see that Brazil and Argentina are amping up their soybeans and arguably could be, in fact, buying American soybeans, marking them up, and enjoying our market with the markup as we struggle. So in that same speech, then Chair Bernanke cites studies which show that the effects of protectionist policies almost invariably lead to lower productivity in U.S. firms and lower living standards for U.S. consumers. Is there any reason to believe that these studies are no longer valid?
None that I know of.
Okay. Chair Powell, I make the point on Bernanke's comments and historic record because we can't afford to put our head in the sand and ignore the facts about the impact of the administration's trade policies on our economy. I think it's clear I've been probably one of the most outspoken critics of the President's trade policy here, certainly on this side of the aisle. And if we want to improve trade, the right way to do it is to expand trade agreements, in my opinion, not impose reciprocal tariffs. And so I am deeply concerned, and I know that at this point you are taking a watchful eye, but I am deeply concerned about the long-term ramifications of this so-called short-term policy. And certainly if we see the next tranche, the $200 billion, and then beyond that we see tariffs on automobiles, we will in fact be in a full-on, escalated, damaging trade war. And I don't know where that ends. And if this is a game of who blinks first, the best thing to do would be to get to the negotiating table. Now, I'm over my time. Yeah, I'm sorry. But I want to make the point that I'm going to stay on this. I'm going to stay on the macro effects of this trade policy because this is not good for our economy, and we are going to look back at this time perhaps in a year and say that's the point at which we turned the corner and the economy started taking a downturn.
Senator Warren.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good to see you again, Chairman Powell. So before the financial crisis, banks loaded up on risky loans while regulators just looked the other way. And when those loans went bad, taxpayers were left holding the bag because big banks didn't have enough capital to stay afloat. Dodd-Frank included two major reforms to make sure that this never happens again. First, rules that make big banks meet higher capital standards so they are better equipped to handle losses. And second, rules that make the banks take annual stress tests to ensure that they aren't taking on too much risk. But since you've taken over, Chairman Powell, the Fed has rolled back on both of these reforms. And I just want to explore what that means for our economy. In April, the Fed proposed an amendment that lowers the enhanced supplementary leverage ratio. That's the special capital requirement for the too-big-to-fail banks. The FDIC claims this reform will allow the banks to maintain $121 billion less in capital. But the Fed disagrees with the FDIC's assessment. Why is that?
We actually think that the effect of that proposed change, which is under consideration, we're looking at the comments, would be pretty close to zero as it relates to the firm itself. And also we think, in other words, if you look at the entire entity, it would be less than $1 billion. I won't say zero, but I think our estimate was $400 million.
So you just think the FDIC's $121 billion estimate is made up?
They're talking about the bank, whereas we're talking about the whole firm. Within the whole firm, at the firm level.
It's the banks we have to worry about and the banks that get bailed out here.
Yeah, and the enhanced supplemental leverage ratio, the problem with this is that we don't want a leverage ratio to be the binding capital requirement because it actually calls upon, if you're bound by that, you're actually called upon to take more risk. Well, so we'd rather not have the bank bound by that.
So let's take a look. Let's take a look at this in terms of trying to strengthen the banks so that we don't have to be in a position to bail them out. The second thing you've done is you've put a lot of stock in the stress tests. And last week you called the stress tests the most successful post-crisis innovation for bank regulation. But under your leadership, the Fed has weakened the stress test regime. Here's one example. Results of this year's exercise recently became public, and reportedly 3 banks, Goldman Sachs, State Street, and Morgan Stanley, had capital levels that were too low to pass the test. I wrote to you about these banks a few weeks ago, and I appreciate your response on this. But just to be clear, after they flunked, did you give those too-big-to-fail banks a failing grade?
We gave them what we call a conditional non-object, which is
Okay, but
something we've
that's
done.
not a failing grade, right? They did not flunk.
They suffered the same penalty, which was to have to limit their distributions to
Well,
the prior years.
That's what I want to ask. If you didn't flunk them, did you at least follow the Fed guidelines and make those banks submit new capital plans that would pass the test?
No, in fact, when we do the conditional non-object, we don't require them to
So
resubmit.
you don't require them to actually meet the
We
criteria.
haven't, in the many times we've used that tool over the years, we've not required that.
In other words, the Fed looked the other way. You let these banks off with what you call a conditional non-objection, letting them distribute capital to their shareholders instead of keeping it on their books. In fact, because of your action, Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs investors took home about $5 billion more than they otherwise would have. That's a nice gift to the bank, Mr. Chairman. On top of that, the Fed also proposed a rule in April that would make the stress tests less severe, effectively reducing capital requirements at the 8 largest banks by a total of about $54 billion, according to a Goldman Sachs analysis. So, Chairman Powell, by your own account, the economy is doing well. We all know that bank profits are gigantic. The banks just got huge tax breaks. 3 Fed presidents, President Rosengren, President Mester, and President Evans, have suggested it is an ideal time to raise capital requirements to strengthen the banks instead of siphoning off cash to shareholders. So why is the Fed, under your leadership, persistently seeking to reduce capital requirements and weaken stress tests?
With respect, Senator, we're not doing either of those things. In fact, the stress test that in 2018 was materially more stressful. The amount of the loss and the amount of required capital to pass the test was the highest by far of any test.
You know, look, I don't know what to say. The FDIC doesn't see it that way. Goldman Sachs doesn't see it that way. The data don't seem to back you up on this. The Fed's capital requirements and the stress test are like a belt and suspenders. You can loosen the belt and rely on the suspenders, or you can take off the suspenders and rely on the belt. But if you do both, your pants will fall down. And Chairman Powell, we learned in 2008 that when the big banks' pants fall down, it's the American economy, American taxpayers, American workers who get stuck pulling them back up. So it looks like to me the Fed is headed in the wrong direction here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Schatz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Powell, thank you for your service, and thank you for being willing to engage. I understand the need for you to stay in your lane, so I'm going to ask a question, and I want to have as constructive of an exchange as possible, knowing that some of this ground has been covered, and I don't want to turn this into a partisan conversation. Banks are doing well. They had record-breaking profits in the years 2016, 2017, and it looks like 18 is going to be another gangbuster year. Across the board, banks increased their dividends by 17% in 2017, 12% in 2018. Community banks' earnings are also up. Household credit is up. In April, after your speech to the Economic Club of Chicago, you said, and I quote, "As you look around the world, U.S. banks are competing very, very successfully. They're very profitable. They're earning good returns on capital. Their stock prices are doing well. So I'm looking for the case for some kind of evidence that regulation is holding them back, and I'm not really seeing that case as made at this point. The data backs up your statement. Banks are the most profitable that they have ever been. So what's the motivation for weakening Dodd-Frank rules like the Volcker rule?"
I think we want regulation to be as efficient as well as effective as it can possibly be. Regulation is not free. regulation, good regulation, has very positive benefits, avoiding financial crises, avoiding consumer harm and things like that. But nobody benefits when regulation is inefficient. And so we've taken the job, particularly for the smaller institutions, going back and looking at everything we've done over the last decade to make sure that we're doing it in the most efficient way possible. That's what we're doing. We want the strongest, toughest regulation to apply to the biggest banks, particularly the 8 SIFIs, and then we want to make sure that we've tailored appropriately as we move down into regionals and sub-regionals, and then large community banks and smaller ones.
Fair answer. What would you say to someone back home who says, why would the Fed focus on this? Why would the banking committee focus on this? Why would the federal legislative branch focus on making life easier for the banks, given income inequality, given that these are literally the most profitable institutions in American history? I get that it's always better to make things more efficient. It just seems like you have limited resources and we have limited political capital to spend on priorities for the Fed. What do I say to someone back home who says, why are you taking care of these guys who seem to be, feeding at the trough pretty nicely?
Well, I think you have to distinguish between different kinds of institutions. I don't think that the smaller community banks are maybe feeling quite as healthy as you're saying. I think they are healthy, but I think we want them to be devoting their efforts to making loans and investing in their communities, supporting economic activities in their communities.
But lending is up, right? And profitability is at least somewhat of a proxy for the efficiency of the regulations. I won't belabor this. I take your answer in good faith. In a recent interview with Marketplace, you were asked what keeps you up at night. This is one of the things I enjoy about you is you're frank in your responses while trying to stay in your lane. And you said, we face some real longer-term challenges, again, associated with how fast the economy can grow and also how much the benefits of that growth can be spread through the population. I look at things like mobility. If you judge the United States against other similar well-off countries, we have relatively low mobility. So if you're born in the lower end of the income spectrum, your chances of making it to the top or even to the middle are actually lower than they are in other countries. Understanding that the Fed cannot address these issues squarely, can you talk a little bit about income inequality and what ought to be done? And then my final question around income inequality is whether, to the extent that you've expressed this view, a tax cut that provides about $33,000 for individuals in the top 1% of earners and about $40 to the poorest of the poor, whether or not that helps or hurts in terms of income inequality.
There are a range of the question I was answering in that interview and that you're really asking is really these are issues that the Fed doesn't have the tools or the mandate to fix, but they nonetheless involve significant longer-term economic challenges. So I just would, I pointed out low mobility, which is the research of Raj Chetty, who's a professor back at Harvard now, and also there's just the stagnation of median incomes for a long time. And if you look at things like labor force participation among prime-age males, you've seen a decline over 60 years. So these are unhealthy trends in the U.S. economy that we don't have the tools to fix. You do. These are things for the legislature to work on. And it comes down to things that are easy to say and hard to do, like improve education, deal with the opioid crisis, things like that. And I also think,